first of all, we will have Marielle. Very cool.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I think the organizers of this event are super excited for you all to be here, and I think it's also awesome for the game dev community as a whole. It's been a long time since I've seen like an in-person event like this where we get to hang out and share knowledge, and so thank you very much to everyone for coming out. And it means a lot to me personally as well, because I've been working on this game for the last 5 years of my life, and I've just been like super excited to finally be able to talk to people about all of the trials and tribulations that we went through and all of the experiments that we tried. So, without further ado, this is building Biomes, and it's how we created all of the environments for Darkest Dungeon 2. Who am I? My name is Marielle Fox, and I am the lead environment artist on Darkest Dungeon 2 at Red Hook Studios. I'm responsible for the creation and implementation of all of the assets and scenes that go into the game that support world building. I was born here in Vancouver, and I have my bachelor's degree in archaeology and art history, which I don't really use, but I also have a certificate in digital animation and modeling. I've been a 3D artist for the last 13 years or so here in town in various industries such as film, television, and video games. As far as video games go, I've spent my time in the AAA space, mobile, and indie space as well. But today I'm talking to you guys about Darkest Dungeon 2. The game's been in development for the last 5 years at Red Hook Studios, and it finally came out May of this year. Please clap. For those of you who haven't played it, why? But here's a little overview of the game. So as a player, you get to road trip through the apocalypse and drive the stagecoach full of your party members through all these different worlds and fight enemies and fight different bosses. It's got the iconic strategic combat from the first Darkest Dungeon game, and is also about managing the relationships of your party members and their stress as you play through the game and face your failures. Now available on Steam and the Epic Games Store. So when I was first hired at Red Hook Studios in 2018, this was one of the very first images. You can hardly see it. This is one of the very first images that our creative director, Chris Brassa, showed me. It is a visual target for one of our biomes, for the city biome, and I love it. I think it's awesome. It encapsulates perfectly what I think Darkest Dungeon is supposed to look and feel like. And it's also kind of cool for me to look at this image now, knowing how that city biome turned out, because I can pretty confidently say that we crushed it as far as the visual target goes. I'm very proud of how the art of the game turned out. But when Chris first showed me this image, I felt like a lot of things. First and foremost, I was super, super excited because, like I said, this image to me looks like Darkest Dungeon. I was so stoked to be part of a team that I could contribute to a game that looks like this. But I was also super, super nervous because I had no idea how I was gonna make a game look like this. And so that's what I get to talk to you guys about today. So as far as the Darkest Dungeon 2 environments go, we have 3 things that I think make up, 3 things that we had to nail to kind of like get that Darkest Dungeon look and feel out of the environments that we wanted. First and foremost, we knew that we were going to make this game in 3D. So we had to figure out how to make all of that Darkest Dungeon art in 3D. Secondly, we had to figure out how we were going to render outlines over all of those 3D assets. Outlines are integral to that Darkest Dungeon look. The look relies heavily on thick black outlines and like pooling black shadows. So we definitely had to solve that rendering thing as well. And thirdly, we knew that we wanted the game to be procedurally generated. So we wanted the game to procedurally generate all of that awesome art that we were going to make. So figuring out how to make the game in 3D was the first thing I had to tackle when I joined the team. From Darkest Dungeon 1 to Darkest Dungeon 2, we knew we were going to shift that the perspective from 2D to 3D. But it was priority number one to always preserve the art direction and the look and the feel of the first game. Fundamentally change how we create that art, but not compromise on its look at all. So here's a little overview of how the first Darkest Dungeon game looks. When you ask people what they love about Darkest Dungeon 1, they say a lot of things. A lot of people love the voice acting, they love how difficult it is, and they love the combat. But for me, what I hear the most and what I see the most is that people fucking love the art, and they love how it looks. It really resonates with a lot of people, and those who've played it recognize it whenever they see it out in the wild. So people love the art from Darkest Dungeon. They're obsessed with Darkest Dungeon art, and they really, really love it. They love the art style so much. They also love the voice acting. Trudy Castle loves Darkest Dungeon art. And so this was the kind of legacy that I was kind of bumping up against when I first joined the team. And it was the pressure that I put on myself when I first started working with the rest of the folks at Red Hook Studios. So, you know, a little bit of imposter syndrome there. But when I first joined the team, I knew that, like I said, everybody fucking loves the art from Darkest Dungeon, but we had to figure out how to make that art 3D for this game. And when I first joined the team, there wasn't really an established environment art team or environment art workflow. When I joined the team, it was just Trudy Castle, who is our environment concept artist and associate art director. It was just her kind of like working on concepts, and that's it. And then when I joined, me. So it was me and Trudy trying to figure out how to make these Darkest Dungeon assets in 3D. And every job that I had before my job at Red Hook Studios, I kind of followed a traditional 3D workflow as far as asset creation goes. And for those of you who aren't 3D modelers or artists, I can distill like a traditional 3D workflow down like super simply into like, you'll get a piece of concept art, and from that concept, maybe you'll make a high-res sculpt of it, and then you'll take that high-res sculpt, make it low poly so that it can be put in game, unwrap your UVs, and then texture it, and then it's good to go. That'll vary from like artist to artist and project to project, but for the most part, that's like generally how it can go. So that was one of the very first things I tried when I joined the team. So we had a whole bunch of concepts ready to go, like this awesome piece for our farm biome, which Trudy made, and some concepts for some of the assets, like this meat house, is what we called it, for the farm as well. So this meat house was one of the very first things I tried to make. And so I did a high-res sculpt of it because it had a lot of organic shapes, and Trudy and I went back and forth a little bit until we were like kind of happy with how it looked from a bunch of different angles. And then I took it into Maya and I retopologized it and made it a low-res 3D model, and then unwrapped the UVs. So at this point, the model was ready for texturing, and we had a couple choices. At this point, I could put it into Substance Painter and then attempt to texture it myself, which means I would have to learn how to paint that Darkest Dungeon art style, or we could teach Trudy how to use Substance Painter, and then she already knows how to paint that style with the heavy ink lines. And so if we could teach her how to use Substance Painter, perhaps she could texture this asset. I also looked over at what the character art guys were doing, and our lead character artist, Kevin, was doing all the models for our heroes, and then he would unwrap them and then send them to Chris Barassa, who would then texture them in Substance Painter. So I figured maybe that workflow could work for environments as well, and maybe Chris could teach Trudy a little bit of Substance Painter. So we got Trudy to paint this up in Substance, and this is what she made. And it looks awesome. It looks great. It looks like Darkest Dungeon in 3D. The only problem was that it took an incredible amount of time for a single asset. It probably took us like a couple weeks just to make this. And like a lot of that was because like we were new, we hadn't worked together before, and we were kind of like working out a bunch of kinks, and Trudy also had to like onboard and learn how to use Substance Painter. And then also she had to like shift her thinking from 2D illustration to 3D asset painting. So it took us a little bit of time. And after we finished this and got in game, we decided that maybe this workflow wasn't great for us because all we were getting done was a single asset for one biome. And we didn't have enough time or enough manpower, essentially. But I wasn't ready to give up on it yet, so I kept thinking about different ways I could shave down that asset creation time. So I gave it another go and checked out some of the concepts for the city and tried to build this house as fast as I could. I skipped the high poly modeling step for this asset and just went into some quick silhouette exploration and then just modeled the low poly version of it straight in Maya, cleaned it up, unwrapped the UVs, and sent it to Trudy for texturing. And she made this. Again, looks awesome. I still love it. These two houses are like some of my favorite assets that never made it in game. It looks really, really good, but again, it was the same problem. It was just taking us way too long to create a singular asset. But we did get it in game though, and that was before anything else existed in Darkest Dungeon 2, but it proved it out. It proved that we could build Darkest Dungeon assets in 3D and achieve the look that we wanted. So like I said, these two houses, as awesome as they look, it ultimately just took us too much time, and there was a big imbalance on workload as well. It really, if we stuck with this workflow, we were essentially asking Trudy to do two different jobs. On top of drawing all of the concepts for all of these assets, we were also asking her to paint bespoke textures for all of those assets as well. So it just really wasn't a viable option for us, we figured. And so I went back to the drawing board and I tried to spend a little bit more time thinking about how we could shave off more time to this asset creation pipeline. And I thought back a little bit to a project that I worked on, Plants vs. Zombies, when I was at Electronic Arts. And I remembered that something that saved us a lot of time was we were working a lot with tileable, reusable textures. And so we had at EA a whole team pumping out tileable textures for all of the modelers. And so when a modeler like me was ready to go, I could just hit the ground running with all of those reusable textures and just like bang out all of the shapes that I wanted, apply the materials, and get into game super fast. And so I thought that might be an option for us. It was potentially a big time saver. And it also meant that Trudy wouldn't have to paint a custom texture for every single asset. A couple of problems that I did anticipate ahead of time though was that it did seem a little bit like we were front-loading all of the work, and so we would have to build up that whole database of textures. Essentially, that like Trudy would have to build up that whole database of textures, and then I would just like sit there and wait for her to finish them so that I could start my modeling. So that was potentially a problem. Another one was that if we used reusable textures, we wouldn't have any of those hard shadows kind of painted into all of the assets because we wouldn't be able to paint unique shadows onto a reusable texture. So we tried it out anyways, and Trudy and I sat down and checked out a lot of the concepts for the city and tried to break down exactly how many different kinds of tileable textures she'd have to make for me to be able to make all these different kinds of assets and variations. And she ended up making like a whole bunch. This isn't even like close to the amount that she made. She just like cranked them out. And she made a whole bunch of different like materials and surfaces and even did like detailed paneling for me so that I could like punch out windows and doors and alcoves and everything. And they ended up looking great. So when she kind of spat out a whole bunch of them, I tried to make as many houses as I could. And I ended up making 2 of these houses for the city in about 3 work days. In hindsight, I realized that it was actually at a completely unsustainable pace though. It was like, I think by the time I started modeling them, the whole team was out of town. I don't know why I wasn't, but everybody in the entirety of Red Hook was in Montreal for like a conference or something, and so it was like just me in the office, and so I could come in on time, plug into the matrix, not converse with anyone, have no meetings whatsoever, work through lunch, and then work really late as well, just to try and see how fast I could make these houses. And so I did it, and I was pretty proud of them, but ultimately I felt like that wasn't a pace that I could keep up for the next like 5 years of my life. And I did end up solving the shadows issue by cutting extra faces into all of the polygons of the house. And so anywhere I wanted a shadow, I would just like draw more polygons into the actual model and fill those faces with black to mimic those shadows. And it ended up looking really cool. The problem was that it wasn't a flexible workflow at all. So anytime Chris or Trudy wanted to make any kind of changes to the model, like if they were like, oh, could you like add a column here or make the whole thing shorter, I was just like devastated because like I'd already like spent hours cutting all these shadows in, and now I have to like change everything or like add even more polygons, which I didn't want to do. So ultimately we decided that this was not the workflow for us either. Now I'm panicking because we're like deep into 2019 and I'm looking around at the rest of the team at Red Hook and like everyone's kind of got their shit figured out. The character guys are like, you know, chugging along, making heroes and enemies, and animation's up and started, combat is starting to work, and like the tech guys are like building their tools and their features, and everything's like kind of chugging along except for environments. And this is when like the imposter syndrome really sets in because there's no one I can hide behind and no one I can blame. So I'm sitting there and I'm feeling like really frustrated with myself, and when I get like frustrated and like anxious with myself, I'll sit there and I'll get like really sarcastic in my head. And so I remember sitting there at work feeling that like inner monologue sarcasm, and I was like saying to myself, I'm like, if everyone just loves the concept so much, I should just put it on a fucking cube and put it in game. No one's even gonna notice. And then I thought about it more and I was like, would they notice? And so was born our texture first, model second workflow. The idea behind it being that Darkest Dungeon 1's art style and art direction is so iconic and so recognizable. Maintaining that integrity of that style was priority number one, so why weren't we just leading with it? And so I remember turning to Trudy one day and saying to her, I was like, one of your concepts for the farmhouses, can you just like clean it up as if it were like that image was going into the game, and just give me like two views, give me the side view and give me the front view, because I think I can just make like a really simple model off of that and just cram it in game in like an hour. And she was like, oh yeah, no problem, that'll take me just like one morning. And so this is the image that she sent me literally in like 2 hours. It was just like a really simple farmhouse, front view, side view, and I banged out a model for it, and it like took us maybe 4 hours in total in one day to get the whole thing in game. So it took Trudy a few hours, took me a few hours to make the model. And I know that like this method is a lot simpler for planar objects like a house, which you can like easily divide up into different sides, and it was potentially a little bit more complicated for more organic shapes or shapes that overlap, but this seemed really promising for us. And so we gave it a go anyways and just tried to see how far we could run with it. Here's the very shitty model that I made. This is not the best modeling I've ever done, but it worked. And we put it in game. Stay on the left. Don't look at the other things. It's all very early. This didn't turn out looking like that, don't worry. But this proved that we could do it and we could do it within an acceptable amount of time. So this was a huge breakthrough for us. This was like a whole new day started for the environment art team at Red Hook Studios. Here's a different example, one with some more complicated shapes. This is just your run-of-the-mill wheelbarrow full of meat, you know, one of those guys. But the way that we approached an asset like this is that Trudy would send me that concept on the left, and then we would sit down together and talk about the best way to divide up that concept so that I could use it as a texture and figure out how to model it properly. And so on the right, we have what we ended up with, where we have the meat separated from the cart version. And all I did was I took that texture, put it into Maya, and just like used the quad draw tool to cut out all of the shapes that Trudy had already drawn. And then just did a little bit of basic modeling to give it some dimension. And there we go. Boom, 3D asset, it's already textured. Yeah, so we proved out that this really quick workflow worked for us. So here it is in game, it's over on the left, our beautiful little meat wheelbarrow. But that was super exciting for us because we ended up taking this method and really making, I think, 99% of Darkest Dungeon 2's environment art assets using this exact workflow. So here are a couple more examples that I thought were really cool. All of the textures down at the bottom were concepts/textures that Trudy drew first, and then the models up top were what we made off of that. And I really like some of these examples, like the boat, where it looks like the side view is really planar and you might not have enough like texture information there. But it totally fucking worked out, and it's great. And we made boats this way and weird, obtuse, organic shapes like this dead fish, and really complicated shapes like that is our hoarder node in game. That was made the exact same way. Trudy just like drew the hoarder. We talked about how to divide up the layers so that I could model it properly, and then I just modeled everything based on what she gave me. This method of asset creation was also great for any kind of like feedback or changes we wanted to make, which was another huge win for us. And so if we made the model and got it in game and decided that maybe like a certain area was a bit too stretched out or distorted, it was super easy for us to kind of rectify that. All we had to do was just like send the texture PSD to Trudy. She painted a bit more details in, and once she saved it and checked it back in, it was already updated in game. So that was it. That was our asset creation solved, and it was a huge relief for me. The turnaround time was the fastest yet, and it was also better distribution of work. It didn't mean that like Trudy had to do concepts and bespoke textures and do 2 different jobs, and it didn't mean that I had to like take Adderall and work 80-hour work weeks for the rest of my life, so it was great. We also got to hire another artist, Nina, who's in Slovenia, to help with asset creation so that I could pivot to more implementation and like in Unity work. Like I said, any kind of like feedback or changes were super easy to accommodate, and we achieved exactly what we wanted. We were trying to make Darkest Dungeon assets in 3D in a reasonable amount of time. So that was it. That was our huge team win. We also had to figure out how to render outlines, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about outlines of the next section, which is map generation, because I wasn't the primary person responsible for solving these issues, but they were really important for the final look, and so I do need to touch on them. The issue that we had with assets was very similar to the 3D asset creation problem. We knew that it was integral to the look of Darkest Dungeon, and we needed to preserve that look, but we were trying to translate something that had originated in 2D and make it a 3D thing. And so with outlines in 2D, if you want an outline on an object, you paint a black outline on it. In 3D, you don't know where the camera is really going to be or what angle the asset's going to be. And so ensuring that we have that thick outline around 3D assets all the time was gonna be a little bit trickier. One of the first things we tried was an art-based solution. A common way to render outlines that you'll see online is artists will take your original mesh and they will duplicate it, extrude it outwards a little bit, and invert the normals so that any kind of overlap you see kind of draws that outline for you if you fill that secondary mesh with black, which is what we're seeing on this column here. And it looks pretty cool in most cases, but there were a whole bunch of problems with it. It made optimization a bit of a nightmare because it automatically doubled the poly count of like every single environment art asset. And there's a lot of environment art assets in this game. And so that wasn't gonna be great. And it also made feedback and changes very difficult. So any kind of changes that we wanted to make to the original mesh, we'd have to either remake the secondary outline mesh or try to make the same changes to it. And that just didn't seem like a fun way to work either. A lot of environment art assets aren't really made originally to accommodate a secondary mesh like that either. They're not really like welded together and watertight like a character model might be because those need to deform. A lot of environment art assets are kind of just like geo-crashed into each other. So when you try to like extrude those faces to make a secondary mesh, you'll get a lot of like weird crashing and rendering in areas that you don't want to deal with. We also tried to do a little bit of shader work, but I am not a shader wizard, and all of the solutions we tried weren't quite good enough as far as like in Unity shaders go. And the way that we eventually solved this was we went through multiple programmers over multiple years, trying out different things, and eventually we worked with a rendering programmer named Manuela who came up with the solution that we use today, which is that the game renders a constant depth pass to always know where the edges of all of those assets are, and then it draws the outlines over those assets. So this is just an image of the game with all of the debug colors on, just to prove that the outlines are there, and they are getting rendered, and it works, and it's very exciting. And thirdly, we have procedural map generation. So from the get-go, we knew that we wanted the game to have node-based map traversal, much like FTL or Void Bastards. And this was a system that was fully built out and supported by a programmer named Colin Toll. He's awesome. If you ever get the chance to work with him or hire him, I 1000% recommend it. He's just extremely talented and communicative. One of my favorite people that I've ever worked with. But I got to work pretty closely with Colin on this feature because all of the tech that he was kind of building out and standing up needed an artist to test it out to tell him whether it was working or not. So I spent a lot of my time on this project working on map generation with Colin. One of the first things we tried to solve with map generation was how big we wanted our tiles to be, and tiles being the object that we wanted the game to pick and generate one after the other. One of the first things we tried were extremely large tiles, like tiles as long as a city block. But we quickly realized that if we had our tiles this big, we would kind of lose that variety that we wanted out of a procedural system. Like if you played the game enough times and the tile was this big, you would just start to recognize it after a while. You'd be like, oh, here's the section that's like the intersection with a library and a statue right beside it. So we ended up making our tiles pretty small. We ended up breaking up our tiles into singular road sections, and then almost every single art asset that we made was a singular tile. So one house was one tile, one crop field was one tile. And we ended up getting the variety that we wanted with this size. After we figured out tile size, we had to figure out what all of our minimum road sections had to be. So we had to figure out what kind of road shapes and what kind of paths the game needed to be able to take all of those pieces and then make a whole biome by itself. So after we figured out what those road shapes needed to look like, then we just created a whole bunch of variations off of it, and then filled in all of the spaces in between with all of those extra set decoration tiles. And that's essentially map generation. At this point, I wanted to throw it back, show you guys how it all kind of looked in 2019. So this was way before we even got outline rendering figured out, before we figured out how to create our 3D assets, and map generation is like just barely getting started. Fast forward 4 years later, and this is how the game looks now. This is a really great image that shows all of the map generation stuff we worked on, all of our beautifully, quickly created 3D environment assets, and all of those outlines rendered on top of it. And that's all, and that is how we created environments for Darkest Dungeon 2. There were a lot of other things that went into it, like optimization and fog, which I do not want to talk about, and post-processing, but for the most part, that's what we got. That's where we are.